The air reaches you first, salt, heavy, and ancient, thick with the memory of storms that have long since passed. Beneath your feet the ground hums faintly, as though the earth itself is breathing in slow, deep waves. Somewhere far below, water moves through dark channels of rock, patient and endless. The horizon ahead is the color of deep glass. There is no shore here, no boundary between water and land. Only the vast pull of the open deep, moving beneath everything, beneath the hum of the ground, beneath the weight of the sky above. This is his domain. His name is Poseidon. He was not always here. Before the sea, before the trident, before the chariot and the palace beneath the waves, there was darkness. A different kind of darkness. Not the darkness of deep water, which has its own cold quality, its own slow pressure. Something closer and smaller, the darkness inside a god. Cronus swallowed him at birth. That is where the story begins. Not at the edge of the water, not in a palace of coral and stone. In the belly of a titan, in a silence that had no bottom. Rhea had known it was coming. She had watched it happen before. Hestia, the firstborn, swallowed before she could draw a second breath. Then Demeter, then Hera, each time the same. Cronus would take the child and open his mouth, and that would be the end of it. He had been told that one of his children would overthrow him. He had decided that none of his children would survive long enough to try. When Poseidon was born, Rhea held him for a moment. Only a moment. Long enough to feel the weight of him, the small warmth of him against her hands. Then Cronus took him. Inside there was no light. No sound that came from outside, only the faint, low rhythm of the Titan's body moving around him. Poseidon did not know where he was. He did not know, in those first long ages of stillness, that he was waiting. He did not know there was anything to wait for, but his siblings were already there. Hestia was the oldest. She had been inside the longest. She had learned a kind of patience that did not require effort. She simply existed, still and quiet, the way a fire is quiet when no wind touches it. Demeter was there too. She did not speak much. She kept herself close to Hestia, her warmth folded inward, contained. Hera was different. She moved. She pressed against the walls of their impossible prison as though testing them, not with violence, but with a steady, persistent weight. She had not stopped expecting to be released. And then there was Hades. He sat apart. Even then, in that strange shared dark, he had a quality of separateness about him. He was not cold, not exactly, but he was quiet in a different way than Hestia. Hestia's quiet was warm. Hades' quiet was the kind that doesn't need filling. Poseidon did not know what to make of any of them. He was the youngest here. He was the newest. He sat among his siblings and felt the thickness of the dark pressing on all sides, and somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the patience and the stillness, something moved inside him. Not anger, not yet. Something more like water finding a crack in stone. He did not know what the sea was. He had never seen it, never touched it, never heard it, but there was something in him that was already shaped for it. Some restlessness that could not entirely stop, the way the sea cannot entirely stop even on the calmest days, even when the surface is flat as glass. He pressed his hand against nothing and felt nothing press back. Time passed. It is difficult to say how long. Gods do not measure time the way mortals do. There was no light to mark the hours. No hunger because they could not starve. No sleeping because they could not sleep. There was only the waiting and the low hum of the world outside, muffled and distant, continuing without them. Then one day something changed. There was movement, a sound from somewhere far above, or perhaps below, or perhaps simply outside, in a direction that had no name. Something shifting, something loosening. Poseidon felt it before he understood it. Hestia felt it first. She straightened. The warmth of her gathered in. then Demeter, then Hera. Even Hades lifted his head, and then release. Poseidon did not remember the details of it clearly afterward. What he remembered was light, sudden and enormous and coming from every direction at once. And air. Real air, not the closed, still air of the dark, but moving air, air that carried something on it. Something he had no word for yet, something cold and salt, heavy and wide. He understood it later, what that smell was. The sea. He stood in the light, blinking, his siblings around him, and he breathed it in. The air with the ocean in it. The air that had travelled across open water before it reached him. He did not know yet that it would be his. He did not know about the lots, or the trident, or the palace beneath the waves. He only knew that he had been breathing closed dark air for an age, and now the air moved. And something in it called to the restlessness he had carried all along. The one who had freed them was young. Younger than Poseidon, which seemed strange, since he had been born first. But Zeus had grown up outside. He had grown up in the open air of Crete, among goats and the sound of wind over rock. He was already tall, already certain of himself in a way that the ones who had been swallowed were not yet. Rhea stood a little way behind him. She was looking at her children, not at Zeus, who was the one who had done the thing, who had tricked Cronus into vomiting the stone and the gods up in sequence. She was looking at the 5 who had been inside. Her eyes moved from one to the next. When they reached Poseidon, they stopped for a moment. He held her gaze. She had held him once, for only a moment. He had felt the warmth of her hands, and then it had been taken from him. He had not thought about it during the long dark. Or perhaps he had, in some way that was not thought exactly, the way deep water holds the shape of things that fell into it long ago. He did not say anything. He was not sure yet what words to use. But the sea air moved between them, and somewhere far off, beyond the horizon that Poseidon could not yet see, the water was already waiting for him. He did not know it yet, but he would find it soon enough. The war came first, before the lots, before the division, before any of them knew what they were owed. The Titanomachy, they would call it later. The great war between the old gods and the new. But in the living of it, there was nothing grand about it. There was rock and ash, and the grinding of forces too large for any one place to hold. There was the sky splitting open and closing again. There was the earth shaking in ways it had not shaken before. Poseidon fought in it. He learned what his body could do. He learned that the restlessness inside him was not just a feeling, it was a force. When he moved against the Titans, the ground moved with him. When he pressed forward, something in the deep stone responded. He did not yet have a name for what he was, but the earth was beginning to recognize him. The war lasted 10 years, by mortal counting. For the gods inside it, time collapsed. There was only the next moment, and the next. Push and resist. Advance and hold. And then, slowly, it ended. The Titans fell. Cronus was defeated. The old order gave way to the new, the way cliffs give way to water, not all at once. Over and over, in pieces, until there is nothing left standing. Afterward, the world went quiet. The 3 brothers stood together, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. They had not grown up together, had not known each other until the release, but war makes a different kind of knowing. They had fought beside each other. They had learned each other's rhythms. Zeus spoke first. He usually did. The world needed to be divided, he said. Not because any one of them could hold all of it, but because things needed tending. Things needed gods to answer for them. There were 3 realms. The sky above, where the clouds gathered and the light moved. The deep water stretching beyond every shore the eye could follow. And the world below, the dark one, the one with no ceiling. Zeus produced 3 markers. Small things, nothing to look at. He turned away while each of them reached into the arrangement and drew. Poseidon felt what he pulled before he saw it. Something cold and smooth, something that smelled faintly of deep water. He looked down at it. He did not need anyone to tell him. The sea was his. He stood still for a moment. The salt, heavy air moved around him, the same air that had reached him first on the day of the release. He breathed it in. He had been breathing it since that morning. He would breathe it for as long as the world continued. Hades drew the underworld. He did not react, not visibly. He simply looked at the marker in his hand for a moment, then closed his fingers around it. Zeus kept the sky. He had not drawn it. He had simply assumed it, quietly, in the way that certain people assume the space they occupy. They stood together a little longer, three brothers on the edge of a world they had just won and were now dividing. There was nothing ceremonial about it. No one gave a speech. The wind moved through the space between them. Then Hades turned and walked away towards something no one else could see. Poseidon watched him go. Then he turned toward the water. He smelled it before he saw it, the cold and the salt and the enormous open distance of it. He walked toward it slowly. He was not in any hurry. The sea was already his. It would not go anywhere while he walked. The shore came up under his feet. He looked at it for a moment. Pale stone, small shells. The place where the water pulled back and then returned, pulled back and then returned. Even here, even at its edge, the sea could not stop moving. He stepped in. The water was cold. It pressed against him with a weight that felt familiar, not from memory exactly, from something older than memory, from whatever had been shaped in him before his birth, before any of this, when the world was still deciding what he would be. He kept walking. The water rose. Past his knees, past his waist. He felt the floor of the sea slope away beneath him, and then he was no longer touching anything solid. He was in it. The sound changed. The above-world sounds, the wind and the distant calls and the creak of the settling earth, all of it fell back. What replaced it was low and steady, a pressure, a hum that had no beginning and no end, the sound of fathoms of water pressing in from all directions. He sank, slowly, deliberately, not falling but choosing. The light thinned as he went down. Above him the surface grew distant. A pale moving ceiling. Below him the dark deepened, layer by layer, growing bluer and then greener and then a colour that had no clean name. He felt the cold move through him, not against him, through him, the way water moves through stone over long years, finding every space, filling every hollow. Near the place called Aigai he stopped. He did not know why there. But the ground rose up in a ridge of pale rock, and something about the shape of it felt right, the way a place sometimes feels before you have any reason for it. He settled into the stillness above that ridge and felt the sea around him. This was his. Not the shore, not the surface where the light played and the boats moved. All of it, from the shallows where children waded to the dark channels where the water was cold enough to stop a heart, to the open deep where no light reached and no living thing had yet found its way. He spread his hands. He felt the water shift with the movement, a slow spread of pressure moving outward in every direction. Something answered, not in words, not in any form he could have described, but somewhere far below, in the deeper dark, the sea acknowledged what had just been decided. He had drawn the lot. He had walked into the water. He had descended to the place below Aigai and held still, and the sea had understood. He was not separate from it. He was not standing in it. He was part of it. He turned slowly in the current. Above him the light moved across the surface, silver and shifting. A faint reflection of the sky he did not own. He watched it for a long time. the way it changed, the way it never completely settled. Even up there, even on the surface, the water could not be still. He understood that. It was the same thing he had always carried. He thought of the marker in his hand, back on the shore. He thought of Zeus and the sky, and Hades already gone into the dark below. 3 realms. 3 brothers, each with something now to answer for. Then the thought dissolved, the way thoughts dissolve in deep water, and there was only the cold and the pressure and the low sound of the sea moving around him. He stayed there a long time. He was in no hurry. The sea had been here before him, and now it would wait on him. It was patient in the way he was not. But perhaps that was the balance of it, the restless god and the ancient water. Each one something the other needed. Far above, the surface shifted, and light passed through it in slow, pale columns, reaching down into the dark and then falling short. Poseidon watched them from below. Then he settled. And the water settled with him, just a little, the way the sea does when nothing is disturbing it, when even its god is still. Before the war, there had been a gift, not given freely. Nothing in those years was given freely. Everything had a price, a purpose, a shape that served the larger struggle. But the Cyclopes had made it with their hands, and that meant something. The Cyclopes made things that lasted. There were 3 of them, brothers, like Poseidon and his kin, though nothing else about them was similar. They were vast and heavy-shouldered, with a single eye set in each broad face, and they had been imprisoned in Tartarus by Cronus for longer than Poseidon had been alive. When Zeus freed them, part of the same turning of events that had freed Poseidon and the others, the Cyclopes did not simply walk out into the world and breathe the air. They went to work. That was what they knew. That was what they were. They made 3 things, one for each of the brothers who would inherit the world. For Zeus, the thunderbolt, bright and branching, crackling with a heat that made the air smell of iron. Poseidon had seen it once, held in Zeus's hand before the final push against the Titans. It lit the whole of the battlefield from above. For Hades, the helm, dark metal shaped to fit a head, with a property that was harder to describe than either of the other 2 gifts. When Hades wore it, he was not merely hidden. He was absent. The eye passed over where he stood and found nothing there. Poseidon had watched it happen. One moment Hades was present. The next, the space simply held air. For Poseidon, the trident. He had held it for the first time on the slope of a hill above a burning plain, in the middle of the 10th year of the war. The Cyclops who brought it said nothing. He held it out with both hands. Poseidon took it with both of his. It was heavy, not in the way a stone is heavy, dead weight pulling toward the ground. This was a different heaviness, a heaviness that pushed back. That pressed against the palm and the fingers and said, "Here I am, something to answer." 3 prongs, set wide. The shaft was dark and smooth, worn already, as though it had been used many times before, though it had just been made. The metal of the prongs held a faint colour, not silver, not grey, something between those, something that shifted when the light changed, the way the surface of deep water shifts. He gripped it. He felt the weapon settle into him, or he settled into it. He was not sure which direction it moved. That was the beginning of it. He had carried it through the last battles of the Titanomachy, through the final push, through the moment when the war broke and the Titans fell back, and then were simply gone, taken down into Tartarus with chains of iron and the sound of the earth closing over them like water over a stone. After, in the quiet that followed the end of a 10-year war, he had kept it close. He had it now, here in the deep beneath Aegae. He had brought it down with him when he descended, and it hung in the water beside him, neither rising nor sinking. Suspended the way only things made by Cyclopes can be suspended, as though the usual rules around them apply partially and no more, he reached out and took it again. The heaviness was still there, the same weight, the same pressure against the palm. It had not changed. He had been in the sea for some time now, long enough for the light above to have shifted, for the pale columns reaching down from the surface to have moved and reformed and moved again. And the trident was exactly what it had been when the Cyclops placed it in his hands. He turned the shaft slowly. The metal of the prongs caught the dim light from above and held it briefly, then released it. He thought of striking with it. He had done it in the war. He had brought it down against rock and felt the shudder travel back through the shaft into his arms, and then outward into the ground beneath, and the ground had moved. Not collapsed, not broken. Moved. A deep, low shiver that ran through the stone the way sound runs through still water. A tremor that started at the point of impact and spread without diminishing for a long distance in every direction. He had not expected that the first time. He had felt the earth answer him before he fully understood what he was doing. The weapon knew its work before he did. Beneath him now, the sea floor lay in its layers of pale rock and dark sediment. Far below the ridge near Aigai, below even the colours that had no names, the earth continued. Solid, patient, full of whatever was stored in the deep rock. He lowered the trident until one prong rested lightly against the sea floor. He did not strike, he only let it rest there. Even so, he felt something, a faint awareness travelling upward through the shaft, through his hand, into him. The rock below was old, older than the war, older than the Titans. It had been there when the world was still finding its shape, and it would be there long after whatever was going to happen next had finished happening. He lifted the trident again. There would be time for all of it. Time to learn what the weapon could do, what he could do with it. Time to find out what it meant to be the god of something as large as everything below the surface. The sea was not one thing. It was many things, stacked and nested. Each layer with its own cold and its own dark and its own creatures moving through it in whatever way creatures of the deep moved. He did not know all of it yet. He found that was not a troubling thought. There was so much he did not know yet. The sea was enormous, and he had only just arrived in it. The knowing would come. It would come the way things come when there is no urgency to them, slowly and without announcement, until one day the thing was simply there, understood, part of him the way the cold was already part of him. He set the trident back into the water beside him and let it hang. Above, the light shifted again. A long, pale column of it descended from the surface, reaching further this time, touching the upper face of the ridge below him before fading. Poseidon watched it. Then the column thinned and withdrew, and the dark settled back, steady and close. He stayed. The trident hung in the water beside him, its prongs holding that faint, shifting colour. Nothing moved. Nothing needed to. The cold settled around him without weight. That was the quality of it down here. Pressure without heaviness, darkness without blindness. He could see what was near him, the ridge of pale stone, the fine sediment that had not been disturbed, the slow movement of his own hand when he turned it. He was learning the sea, the way you learn a room, by staying in it after the lamp has gone out, not by looking, by remaining. Some time passed. He did not measure it. Then something moved at the far edge of his sight. Not one thing, several. Small figures at a distance, moving through the water with the ease of creatures that had lived there always. They were too far to resolve clearly, but he watched them until they were gone, pulled away by whatever current ran along the upper face of the ridge. He had seen the Nereids before. At the surface, in those early days when he was still learning what the surface felt like from below, 50 daughters of old Nereus, the sea's elder, who had held the water before Poseidon, had come down into it. Nereus had not contested the arrangement. He had simply continued as he was, moving through the deep water with the patience of something that had never needed anything to change. His daughters moved with the same patience. Poseidon had watched them without making himself known. That had seemed right in those early days. The sea had its own inhabitants. They had their own ways of moving through it. He had not wanted to arrive among them the way a stone arrives in still water with disruption, with everything rippling outward from the point of impact. But there had been one. Among the 50, one he had noticed differently. Not in the way of the others, who moved like water themselves, who seemed almost continuous with the current around them. She moved with intention, a direction to it, as though she knew where she was going and had known for some time. Her name was Amphitrite. He had learned it from the water itself, the way you learn things in the deep. A name carried on the slow movement of currents, spoken by no voice he could identify, simply present in the way the cold was present. He had approached once. Only once. She had moved away. Not quickly, not in what he would call panic, but with clarity, a direction chosen without hesitation and then held. She went up, and then away, and then further away, until the water gave no trace of her. He had not followed. He had stayed in the place where she had been, and let the water close back over the space she had occupied. The current carried her scent, if that was the right word for what water carries of a person, something particular, something that distinguished that water from the water around it. Salt and cold and something he could not name. Then that too was gone. He returned to the ridge beneath Aegae. He kept his stillness. He held the trident, and the trident held its weight against his palm, and the two of them waited in the dark without deciding anything. He was not troubled by what had happened. He understood her movement as clearly as he understood his own. The sea had not asked his permission when he came down into it. Why should anything in it simply receive his presence without question? But he had not stopped thinking about her. The dolphin came to him weeks later, perhaps longer. Time in the deep did not arrange itself in weeks, but there had been enough light cycles above for him to use that word without it feeling wrong. The dolphin had been swimming the outer range of the ridge, looping back and forward in the patient way dolphins move when they have decided to stay near something. Poseidon had watched it without moving. The dolphin had come closer, then closer still, until it hung in the water a few lengths away, regarding him with one dark eye. Poseidon was familiar with dolphins. They were among the oldest things in the surface water. Quick and warm in ways the deep creatures were not. They moved at the boundary, comfortable above and below, belonging to neither world completely. He found he did not want to send it away. He asked it. Not with words, if it could find her. The dolphin turned. It moved up smoothly without hurry until the light took it and it was gone. He waited. The light above moved across its full range. Then again. He watched the pale columns descend and shift and withdraw and return. He held the trident. He did not strike the stone. He simply sat in the cold and the dark, and the sea moved around him in the slow, enormous way it moved. Then the water changed, not in any way he could have pointed to. But he felt it, a shift in the particular quality of what surrounded him. Something present that had not been present before. She came from the west, from the open water beyond the ridge, moving with that same intention, that same held direction. The dolphin swam beside her, close enough that their movements influenced each other. Two creatures coordinated without effort. Amphitrite did not hurry. She arrived, and then she was there. She stopped at a distance. Not too far, not close enough to touch. She was looking at him with an expression he did not yet know how to read, something in it that was neither fear nor welcome, but something between those, something that contained both without being resolved into either. Poseidon did not move. He let her look. He let her take whatever measure she needed to take. The trident hung in the water beside him. The cold pressed in from every direction. Above, a column of pale light descended, reaching further than usual. And in that light he could see her clearly. She was looking at the trident. Then she was looking at him. He waited. After a time that he did not measure, she moved, not away. Forward, only slightly, but forward. The dolphin circled once between them, slow and easy, then drifted back. It was not a beginning exactly. It was the moment before a beginning, the pause just before something becomes itself. But Poseidon felt the change, the way he had felt the tremor, travel up the shaft of the trident when the prong touched stone, through the hand, into the arm, deeper than that. The dolphin turned a slow circle in the water above them both. He thought, without quite deciding to think it, that the creature had done something that could not easily be accounted for. It had moved through the sea without instruction, had found what it was looking for, had spoken in whatever way dolphins speak, and had returned. He would remember it. The dolphin drifted higher, following the pale light upward until it broke through into the bright world above. Poseidon watched it go. Then he looked back at Amphitrite. She was still there. What had passed between them was not an agreement. It was something smaller than that. A willingness to remain. Poseidon understood the difference. He did not press it. He did not ask anything of her with his eyes or his hands or the trident hanging in the water at his side. He simply stayed where he was, and she stayed where she was, and the cold moved through the space between them with the same patience it moved through everything else. Over the days that followed, measured again by the pale columns shifting overhead, she came back to the ridge, not always close. Sometimes she remained along the upper face, moving among the other Nereids in the way she always had, her motion distinct from theirs without being separate, but she came. And Poseidon noticed the difference between the days she was present and the days she was not, and did not comment on that difference to anyone. There were no words yet. There were long stretches of time when no words were needed. The trident rested across his knees. The sediment settled fine and pale around the base of the ridge. Above, the light shifted through its full range and back again. He was content. He had not expected to be. The call from Olympus came as a disturbance in the upper water. Zeus did not send messengers in the way a king might send a rider. He simply made his intention felt, and the feeling moved downward through the fathoms like pressure, like a change in depth. Poseidon rose through the water without haste. He broke the surface into cold morning air and took in the world above. It looked the same as it had always looked from below. Bright and thin and in motion, he went to where he was summoned. The task Zeus named was this: the walls of Troy. King Laomedon needed walls. Great walls, wide enough to stop an army, high enough to make one reconsider. The king had asked the gods for their labor, and Zeus had agreed on behalf of two of them. Poseidon was one, Apollo was the other. Poseidon did not refuse. He had no reason to refuse, not then. They went to the Troad, to the wide plain above the sea. The land was flat near the shore, and rose gradually inland, and on the highest ground the city sat in its unfinished state, surrounded by the foundations already laid by human hands. The stone was pale limestone, local, quarried from the hills to the east. It smelled of chalk and dry earth, and the particular dryness of land that had seen no rain in weeks. Apollo watched from a distance at first. He was not by nature a labourer. But the work required both of them, and so he took his place beside Poseidon, and they began. Poseidon worked without complaint. He moved stone the way he moved through water, with attention to weight, to resistance, to the path of least difficulty through a given mass. He could feel the grain of the limestone under his palms. He set each course with care, not because Laomedon deserved it, but because the walls deserved it, because stone placed correctly stays placed. Apollo played at intervals. The music did something to the stone, or to the men who worked alongside them, or to the air above the plain. It smoothed the work without reducing it. The walls rose. They rose slowly, because walls do. Light cycles passed. The plain cooled toward autumn. The city began to look like a city. Poseidon kept working. He did not speak much to Apollo. Apollo did not speak much to anyone. They were very different, and both of them knew it, and the knowledge required no discussion. Laomedon came to observe. He was a tall man, narrow in the chest, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being agreed with. He walked along the base of the rising wall and said nothing of use. He touched the stone with 2 fingers, as a buyer touches cloth. He looked satisfied. Poseidon watched him. Something in Laomedon's manner sat incorrectly. Not an action, not a word, simply a quality of attention, a way of looking at finished work that held no understanding of what the work had cost. Poseidon noticed it and said nothing. The walls were completed as the year turned cold. They stood well. Anyone with eyes for such things could see it. The courses were even. The joints were tight. The towers at the corners rose straight against the sky. From the plain below, the walls of Troy looked like something that had always been there and always would be. Laomedon came again to look. He stood at the base of the largest tower. He set one hand against the stone. He turned to Poseidon and Apollo. He said he would not pay. He offered reasons. The reasons did not matter. They were the kind of reasons people offer when they have decided on the answer before consulting any facts. He spoke about the nature of the agreement, about what had been promised and by whom, about whether divine labor could truly be said to require mortal compensation. He spoke with great confidence. He looked, while he spoke, at some middle distance rather than at either of them directly. When he finished, the plain was quiet. Apollo left. He left without striking anything. He was gone before Poseidon had decided what to think about what had just happened. Poseidon stood at the base of the wall he had built. He touched the stone once with his palm. It was warm from the afternoon sun. The surface was smooth where his hands had set it. He could trace the seam where one course met the next, the exact line he had worked with, the full weight of his attention. He turned and walked toward the coast. The sea was there below the plain. Grey-green and moving, the same water it had always been. He walked into it without slowing. The cold rose around him as the ground dropped away, and the light from above came down in the pale columns he knew. He went down. At a depth where the surface sound became only a low and distant pressure, he stopped. He held the trident. He did not strike anything. What he felt was not grief, and it was not exactly rage. It was something that sat between them, quieter than both. The walls had been built well. The labor had been given in good faith. These were facts. They did not change because Laomedon had looked at that middle distance and offered his reasons. But something remained unpaid, and Poseidon understood, in the way the sea understands accumulation, that unpaid things do not disappear. They wait. He stayed in the deep water for a long time. Then he turned his attention to the coast of the Troad, to the shoreline below the walls he had built, and he let the sea do what the sea does when something moves beneath it without warning. The creature he sent was immense and patient. It came from the far water. It moved without haste toward the shore. It did not need instruction. It simply arrived, and the coast of Troy received it. And the city that stood behind the walls Poseidon had built spent its next seasons learning what it meant to have refused him. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt only that the account had been opened. What remained in it would be settled later by others, in ways he could not yet see but did not need to. The water around him was cold and still. The trident rested against his palm. He turned back toward the ridge beneath Aegae. Amphitrite was there when he returned. She was near the upper face of the ridge, not far. She looked at him with that same unresolved expression, neither fear nor welcome. He settled into the dark at the base of the ridge. She did not ask where he had been. Time passed beneath the ridge. The pale columns overhead shifted, lengthened, and faded as light moved through the water above. Poseidon rested the trident across his knees. The sediment at the base of the ridge had not moved. Nothing here moved unless he did. Amphitrite remained on the upper face of the ridge. She was not looking at him directly. She was tending to something among the rock formations above, her hands moving with the unhurried attention of someone performing a task she found familiar. A Nereid moved beside her, then drifted away. The other Nereids kept their distance from him, as they had from the beginning. Amphitrite did not keep her distance. She did not move closer either. This was how it had been since her return. A summons reached him in time. He felt it before he recognized its shape. It came from above, from the land, from a place of dry stone and open sky. It carried the particular texture of a challenge, not from an enemy, not from a titan, but from another god, from his own kin. Athena. He rose from the ridge without speaking. The water around him shifted as he moved upward through it. Light came down to meet him, growing stronger as the depth lessened. He surfaced in the Saronic Gulf, and the air hit his face dry and carrying the smell of pine resin and warm rock. The Acropolis rose above the city below it. He had seen the rock before. It stood on its own terms, high above the plain, visible for a long distance in every direction. The city spread around its base, modest still, but growing. It needed a patron. The gods had assembled to decide which of them it would receive. He walked up. Athena was already there when he arrived at the top of the rock. She stood near the center of the plateau, straight-backed, her grey eyes tracking him as he came up the path. She said nothing. There was no need. Both of them understood why they were here. The gods had gathered to one side, near the northern face. Zeus was not among them. He had declined to judge. Poseidon noticed this. It was a careful absence. The ground beneath his feet was limestone, pale and dry, fissured in places where the rock had shifted over long years. The light was direct and strong, no shade on the high rock. He looked at Athena. She looked at him. No hostility passed between them. They were not enemies, not yet, and both of them were careful enough to know that this moment did not require it. It was a contest. Contests have rules. Rules make things clean. He lifted the trident. He drove it into the rock. The impact travelled down through the limestone and into the deep structure of the hill. He felt the shudder of it through the shaft, up through his hands and shoulders. Then water came. It rose through the crack the trident had opened, clear at first, then carrying its character, salt. The sea pushing up through solid rock onto the high plateau of an inland hill. The gathered gods moved closer. The spring was steady. It flowed from the crack and ran across the limestone in a thin, bright line, finding the lowest path. It smelled of the sea. It was the sea, drawn up by the trident through hundreds of feet of stone. It was not a small thing. He stepped back and held the trident at his side. He let them look. Athena moved to a clear space nearby. She carried something, a small shoot, a thing of green and silver, barely visible for its smallness. She pressed it into a crevice in the rock. She said nothing. She simply placed it and moved back. The shoot held. It grew. Slowly enough that the watching was not dramatic, no sudden bursting of branches or spread of leaves, but steadily, undeniably, putting down roots into the limestone that should not have been able to support them. The grey-green of its first leaves caught the dry attic light. An olive tree. The assembled gods looked from the spring to the tree. They consulted among themselves in low voices. Poseidon waited. The salt water moved across the stone beside him. He knew, before they spoke, what the answer would be. The tree offered oil, timber, food, shade. It would grow and be pressed and give the city something it could use across generations. His spring was striking. His spring was real. Salt water rising through solid rock was a thing that had not been done before and might not be done again, but salt water could not be drunk. It could not be pressed or eaten. It demonstrated power without offering much beyond the demonstration. He did not argue this. He understood it before any of them said it. The decision came. The city would take Athena's name. Athena would be its patron. Her tree would root in the Acropolis stone. He looked at her across the plateau. She met his eyes. There was no triumph in her face. Only the clean fact of having won, which she accepted the way she accepted everything, directly, without performance. He inclined his head once. She returned the gesture. Then he walked back down the hill. At the base, where the path levelled out and the city began its scatter of walls and doorways, he stopped. He did not look back at the rock. There was no reason to. The spring would keep flowing. Salt water on the Acropolis, his mark in the limestone, whether the city claimed his name or not. He thought about the walls of Troy. Built with full attention, refused payment after. This was not the same. This was a contest, entered willingly, lost fairly. The difference was real, and he held it clearly. He walked south, back toward the sea. The Saronic Gulf received him as the evening light came down across the water. He waded in without slowing. The cold rose, familiar, and then he was under it, and the sound of the world above became a low pressure above his head. He descended. The ridge beneath Ege was where he had left it. The sediment at its base lay undisturbed. He settled at the base. The trident rested against his palm. Above him, on the upper face of the ridge, Amphitrite moved between the stones. She had not left. He had not expected her to leave. What had passed between them since her return was not a promise or an agreement. It was something that did not require a name. She remained. He remained. The water around them was cold and dark and absolute. After a while she came a little lower on the ridge. Not to him. Not quite. She settled on a ledge perhaps 10 arm lengths above his position. Her back was to the rock face. She looked out into the open water the same direction he was looking. He did not speak. She did not speak. The pale columns overhead moved slowly as the light above shifted and then faded. The deep water settled into its nighttime dark. Below them the sediment was still. Around them the current was almost nothing. Poseidon held the trident loosely. He thought of the spring on the rock, still running above the city that had chosen another name. He thought of the seam in the wall at Troy, the exact line where his hands had set one course against the next. Both still there. The water pressed close on all sides, steady and enormous. Amphitrite's presence on the ledge above was a small thing inside that enormity, small and, in some way he did not examine closely, sufficient. He did not move, neither did she. The night deepened above the water, not visibly, not in any way that could be watched, but Poseidon felt it. The quality of the pressure changed. The light that had been filtering down in pale columns withdrew by degrees, narrowing, thinning, until it was gone entirely. The deep water around the ridge was the same in darkness as in dim light, but he knew the difference. Above the surface, somewhere to the southeast, the Aegean was settling into its nighttime motion. Long, slow swells. No wind yet. He rose from the base of the ridge, not toward the surface, not toward the world above. He rose along the ridge face, moving through the dark water without hurry, following the shelf upward until he reached the broader ledge where his horses were stabled in their cut of rock. They were there. 3 of them standing in the close dark, their breath moving the water in small pulses around them. They were not ordinary horses. Their manes moved without current. Their hooves, when they shifted weight, left no impression in the sediment. They had been with him since the lots were drawn, since the sea became his, and he had first descended to learn what the sea contained. He ran his hand along the neck of the nearest. The animal turned its head toward him. patient, still. He did not harness them, not yet. He simply stood with them for a while, his hand against the horse's neck, feeling the slow movement of its breathing. The warmth of it was unusual down here. Unusual and familiar. After a time he took the harness from its place in the rock. He worked without rushing. The straps were cold but soft, worked smooth over a very long span of use. He fitted each piece without looking at it. His hands knew the order. The horses accepted it. He drew the chariot out from the deeper recess behind them. It was not elaborate, wide enough, solid, built for open water rather than display. The yoke settled over the middle horse's shoulders. He took the reins. They rose. The water thinned around them as they climbed. The pressure lifted. He felt the surface before he reached it, the boundary where the sea's weight released and the air began. Then they broke through. The Aegean at night was black and moving. The stars above were sharp, no moon yet. The swells ran low and regular from the north, and the chariot moved with them, carried by the horses whose legs churned not water but something underneath it, some deeper motion that was the sea itself. He drove south along the line of the islands, no particular destination. The island chain lay to his left, their ridgelines dark against the stars. Lights on a few of the slopes, small and distant. He did not go closer. The horses ran well. Their breath rose ahead of them, and the spray came back in a fine mist that settled on his skin and tasted of deep salt. Below the chariot's passage the water ran clear. He could see down into it. Not far, the surface light was low, but far enough to see the shifting dark. Around him the sea moved, not away from him exactly. Creatures do not flee Poseidon, but there was an awareness in the water. Fish turning in their schools to face his direction, then resuming their movement. Something large passing deep below, adjusting its course without breaking the surface. A pod of dolphins tracking parallel to his passage for a time, then peeling off into the dark as if they had always intended to. He let the reins sit loose. The horses knew this stretch of water. They ran the familiar arc south towards Sunium, and then eased west as he drew the reins slightly, crossing the open channel, moving through the shadow of the islands. The chariot did not rock. The horses kept the surface flat under them. He drove for a long time without thinking of anything in particular. There was the water. There was the night. There was the sound of the horses and the sound of the sea, which were not so different from each other. Eventually he brought them around. He turned north again along the eastern side of the chain and let the horses slow to a walk over the water. The swells here were shorter, interrupted by the island's presence. The chariot moved through them in a different rhythm. He sat with it. Overhead the stars had rotated. Some time had passed. He could not have said how much, and had no reason to measure it. He thought of the spring. Running across the limestone in the dark now, no light on it, no gathered gods to observe it, just the water finding the lowest path across the rock. The smell of the sea on a hilltop, far from any coast. He wondered if any of the city's people had walked up in the night and found it. Whether they'd smelled it and understood what it was, or whether they'd only tasted the salt and been confused, it did not matter. It was there. He drew the horses to a stop on the open water. They stood on the surface. The water held them, a flat space of stillness in the moving sea. He sat with the reins in his hands and looked north toward where Aegae lay beneath the surface, the ridge, the stable cut into the rock, the ledge where Amphitrite had settled herself facing the open water. He thought of her there, still probably, her back against the rock, looking out into the same dark he was looking into from above. He turned the horses. They descended with less drama than they had risen. The surface closed over them. The sound of wind and the smell of air disappeared, and the deep replaced them. The pressure returned to his shoulders, familiar as anything he knew. He brought the chariot back to the ledge and stepped down. The horses stood quietly while he removed the harness. He returned each piece to its place. Then he led them back into the recess and left them standing, patient in the dark. He descended again to the base of the ridge. Amphitrite had not moved. She was above him still, on the same ledge, facing the same direction. Her outline was faint in the deep dark. He could tell she was awake. There was a quality to stillness that differed between sleeping and watching. She was watching. He settled at the ridge's base and took the trident across his knees. The sediment around him was undisturbed. He had not disturbed it going or returning. The current was very low, almost nothing. The stars above the surface were invisible from here, but he held their positions in his mind the way he always did. The slow wheel of them through the night. He had placed one star there himself years back. Small, steady. The dolphin star. He thought of Delphinus. The way the creature had gone out without instruction and returned with something that could not be demanded. Some things could only be offered freely or not received at all. The water around the ridge was very dark and very still. Amphitrite's presence on the ledge above was a sound he could not quite hear. A weight he could feel at a small distance. He did not look up at her. She did not look down at him. The night continued above the surface. Down here there was no night exactly, only depth, and the dark that depth produced, and the two of them settled into it without urgency. The trident was cool across his knees. The sediment was undisturbed. The horses breathed in the cut of rock above. The sea pressed close on all sides. He had known about Thetis for a long time, not in the way that knowledge arrives suddenly. More in the way that the sea knows a stone on its floor, present, familiar, unremarkable, until the moment it becomes something else. She was one of the Nereids. 50 daughters of old Nereus, and most of them moving through the deep water with no particular weight to their presence. But Thetis was different. There was something in her that the water recognized, a quality he had noticed long before he named it to himself. He sat at the base of the ridge with the trident across his knees. The thought arrived without announcement. Thetis, he did not push it away. He let it settle in the dark water around him and considered it plainly, the way he considered everything that lived in his domain. He had wanted her. That was simple enough to say in the dark, where no one was listening but the sea. Not in the way he had wanted other things, land, a city, the satisfaction of his gift being chosen over another's. This had been quieter, something he had carried without examining it. He shifted the trident slightly across his knees. And then the prophecy. He did not remember now exactly when he had first heard it. These things did not arrive cleanly in the deep water. They filtered down like light, diffuse, changed by the time they reached him, but the content of it had been clear enough. Thetis would bear a son who surpassed his father. He had turned that over many times. Not with anger, more with the same careful attention he gave to the seafloor's shifting, the slow movement of sediment under long currents. A son who surpassed his father. If the father was a god, the son would be something greater. If the father was Poseidon, the child would hold more than the sea, more than the trident, more than the earth that trembled under his strike. He had sat with that for a long time. Zeus had heard the same prophecy. He knew that much. The two of them had arrived at the same understanding by separate paths, in the way that large things moving toward the same truth often did, not by speaking, but by stopping. They had both stopped. Thetis would not marry a god. The prophecy had made certain of that, not through prohibition, but through the simpler mechanism of consequence. No god who understood the words would walk toward them knowing what they carried. He looked out into the dark water beyond the ridge. The current was almost nothing, a faint pressure against his forearm. The sea was not entirely still, it never was, but it was close. He thought of Thetis. Where she was now, he could not be certain. Somewhere in the deep water. The Nereids moved through the sea without pattern, without the regularity of the horses on their route, without the predictability of the currents he charted across his palm in the dark. She would be given to Peleus. That had been decided, or rather, it had arrived at the place all decisions eventually reach, where the alternatives have closed one by one until only one remains. Peleus was mortal, strong by mortal measure, one of the Myrmidons, a man who had sailed and fought and accumulated the particular dignity that certain mortals gathered before they faded. Thetis would not want it. He understood that without needing to be told. She had fled him once, the first time he had approached her. She had moved through the water with the speed the Nereids carried, effortless, like the sea itself redirecting, and he had not followed far. You could not follow something that knew the water as well as you did. Now she would be given to a man who could not follow her into the deep at all. He thought about what that meant, what she would carry with her. A god's knowledge of the sea and a mortal husband above it. The thing the prophecy produced was not only a child. It was a particular grief, the kind that came from knowing exactly what was happening and having no ground from which to refuse it. The trident was cool and familiar across his knees. Above him, on the ledge, Amphitrite had not moved. He could feel her presence in the dark, the same way he had felt it since returning from the surface, not through sound or light, but through some other register the deep water kept for things it held. She had known about Thetis too, probably. Amphitrite knew most things she wanted to know. She had never asked him anything directly about it. That was her way, not silence from ignorance, but silence from a kind of dignity that did not require answers aloud. He had not brought it here deliberately. The thought had arrived on its own, but he was aware, sitting at the ridge base with the sediment undisturbed around him, that he was letting it settle here. In this particular dark, near her particular stillness above him. The sun would be Achilles. He did not know the name yet. Names arrive after the fact, carried back on the current of what has already happened. But he understood the shape of the child that the prophecy described. Bright, burning, short, a thread measured out with unusual density, the way Lysis sometimes allotted, not long, but weighted with everything that could be compressed into it. He thought of that child moving through a world he would not live long enough to wear smooth, the way certain mortals did, fast and complete and gone. And Thetis would know it before the child was born, probably. A Nereid could read those currents. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel about the loss of her. There was something, yes, a kind of recognition that something had been present and was now resolved in a direction that removed it. But it was not grief precisely, more like what happened when the water receded from a shore and you could see clearly what the depth had covered. What he felt, sitting with it honestly, was something closer to relief. Not that Thetis would suffer, he did not want that. But the prophecy had simplified everything. The thing he had carried without examining had been resolved by something older and more settled than his own choosing. Some things could only be offered freely or not received at all. The thought returned without announcement. He recognized it from earlier, from thinking about Delphinus, about what the creature had done that could not be commanded. This was the other side of it. Some things could not be received at all. Not because the reaching was wrong, but because what waited at the end of the reach was a consequence no one with clear sight would choose. He adjusted the trident across his knees. The sediment around him was still undisturbed. He had sat here long enough that the water had grown accustomed to him. Small things had resumed their movement nearby. He could feel the faint displacement, nothing visible. Just the sea doing what the sea did when nothing was threatening it. Above him, Amphitrite sat against the rock. She had gone out without instruction and returned. That was not how Delphinus had done it. but the structure was similar, something given freely before it was asked for, something that could not be demanded and had not been. He did not look up. The current ran very low across his forearm, almost nothing. Thetis would have her mortal husband and her mortal grief, and the brilliant, brief child the prophecy had already made certain. Peleus would have something he could not fully hold and probably knew it. And somewhere in all of that, a boy would be born who would surpass every father the world had ever given a child. Poseidon sat with that in the dark water. The sea pressed close on all sides. The depth above him was very great. The horses breezed in the rock above, patient, warm in the cold deep. The ridge held them all. The water held the ridge. Nothing moved that did not mean to. He rose from the ridge without deciding to. The movement was not deliberate. It happened the way certain things happened in deep water, a shift in pressure, a reorientation, and then he was standing, the trident loose in one hand, the sediment below him completely still. He looked up through the dark column of water above. Nothing visible, only depth. He had been thinking about the child for a long time, about Thetis and Peleus and the bright thread already measured. He had been sitting with all of that, letting it settle into the cold floor of the sea. Now he was done sitting. The trident turned in his hand, easy and familiar. Its weight was something he had known for longer than most things had existed. He felt the butt of it graze the rock at his side, a small sound. Almost nothing. He thought of the earth above the water, not the surface of the sea. Below that, the ground beneath, where soil pressed against bedrock, where old stone held the memory of everything that had ever moved through it. He had done this before. He knew what came next. He walked from the ridge slowly through the dark. The current that had been nearly nothing was nothing now. The water simply held him, and he moved through it the way he always moved, without hurry, without any particular expression of effort. The sea floor changed beneath him as he walked. Fine sediment gave way to stone. Stone gave way to a shelf of darker rock, older than the sea above it. He had walked this particular geography before. He knew where it led. He was rising now, without having chosen to rise either. The deep water above him grew fractionally less dark. Not light, nothing like light, but the quality of the dark shifted. He continued up. When he reached the surface, it was still night. The water was flat. Moonlight lay across it in a broad, cool band. He stood where the sea floor met the shore, not quite land, not quite sea. The rock under his feet was slick with weed and salt. The air was cold. He had not been above the water since thinking about Thetis. He did not know how long that had been. The moonlight on the surface was very still. Nothing moved. The shore was empty. Pale gravel and dark stone, scattered shells, the line of foam at the waterline white and faint in the dark. He looked at it for a moment. At the boundary, at the place where the sea stopped. Then he raised the trident, not dramatically, not in anger. He simply brought it up and held it at shoulder height, balanced, the way it was always balanced in his hand, and then he drove it down into the rock. The impact was quiet. That was what people never understood. When the ground moved, the strike itself was almost soundless, a deep contact, a transfer. The sound came after, travelling outward. The rock received the trident. He held it there, and from the ground, not from the sea, not from the water, from the earth itself, something began. It did not come all at once. It came the way things come when they have been held in waiting for a very long time and have finally been given permission. A trembling first. Not violent, just a trembling deep below the surface of the ground, like something turning over in the dark. Then the earth moved, not in collapse, not in rupture. It rose. He watched. The ground lifted along a seam that ran from the trident's base outward into the pale gravel. and from that seam, from the cold, dark earth, an animal pushed upward. It was large, larger than anything the land had yet produced that moved this way. It came up slowly, head first, then the great arch of neck, then the body, then the legs folding and then unfolding as they found air beneath them, dark with earth. Still, for one long breath, completely still. Then it exhaled. The sound was low, soft, a breath of something that had never breathed before. He stood and did not move, the trident in the earth between them. The animal lifted its head. It did not look at him exactly. Its eyes were dark and very large, and they took in the moonlit shore and the flat water and the pale sky above the horizon without fixing on any of it, as though everything was equally new, as though the eye itself was still learning what seeing was. Its legs were long, finer than he would have expected. They trembled faintly, not with weakness, but with the effort of standing in a world that had not existed for it until this moment. He pulled the trident from the rock. The seam in the earth closed slowly. The ground settled. There was no mark left, or almost none, a faint disturbance in the gravel, already being smoothed by the thin foam coming in from the sea. The animal stood. It did not move toward him, did not move away. It breathed in the cold salt air, and its sides rose and fell with it, a large steady motion, like something that had always known how. He looked at it. The moonlight lay across its back in a long, pale band. The neck curved down and then lifted again. The animal shifted its weight from one foot to another, finding the ground, understanding what ground was. It was the newest thing in the world. He had made many things. He had raised islands from the sea floor, cut channels through stone, set a constellation in place for a dolphin that had gone out and returned without being asked. He had built walls and driven a chariot across the surface of the sea, while creatures below turned to watch. None of those things had stood up. None of them had breathed. The animal lifted its head again, and the moonlight caught its eye. Dark, steady, holding nothing that could be named, holding nothing yet. He did not touch it. Some things needed to be left alone in their first moment. Whatever was going to be made of this creature, whatever riders and wars and long plains it would one day carry, none of that had happened yet. All of that was still somewhere ahead, in the current of what had not yet arrived. Right now it was only standing, breathing the cold air, taking the measure of the shore. He turned back toward the water. The sea lay flat under the moon, still and wide and holding everything below it, the ridge, the horses breathing in their rock, Amphitrite on her ledge, the undisturbed sediment of the deep floor. He stepped in. The cold moved up around him slowly. Then, all at once, behind him, on the shore, the animal exhaled again. He heard it, faint and low, carried just far enough on the night air to reach him before the water closed over his shoulders and the sound of the surface world fell away. He descended. The dark came back around him steadily, not all at once, but in layers, the cold first, then the pressure, then the silence that was not quite silence, but the low, constant hum of water moving over stone. He descended without effort, the trident held loosely at his side. Below him, the sea floor spread outward in the dark, fine sediment, old rock, the ridge running east, its edges softened by years of slow current. He had been away from it, for he did not measure the time. Time moved differently up there, on the shore, in the air. It moved in breaths and heartbeats. Down here it moved in tides. He settled onto the rock shelf without sound. Above him, far above, the moonlight filtered down through fathoms of water. It arrived thin and blue and barely there, nothing like the hard white band it had laid across the animal's back. Down here everything was gentled, edges rounded. Light dispersed. He sat with the trident across his knees. For a while he did not move. The water moved around him, slow and without direction. Small creatures passed at the far reach of his sight, pale and unhurried. The sediment on the floor lay undisturbed. Everything was as he had left it. He was thinking about Polyphemus. Not with sharpness, not with the feeling that made the water near him tighten and shift. With something quieter than that. Something that had been sitting in him for some time, working its way down through the layers, the way cold works through stone, slowly. Without announcement, arriving fully only when it is already deep inside. He had a son. Had many sons. But Polyphemus was his, recognizably in the old way, large and ungovernable, and belonging to no court, no city, no arrangement of civilized things. He lived in his cave on his island and tended his flocks, and that was all he had wanted. That was all. Odysseus had come through. Poseidon had not been there. He was rarely on the surface during the years of that war. He had his own feeling about Troy, about walls he had built with his own hands, and the insult that had followed, and he had chosen his side and kept to it. But he had not been on that island, had not been watching. When it reached him, it came the way news reaches the deep places, not fast. Through the water, through the pressure, through the slow passage of current carrying information from shore to shore. Odysseus of Ithaca had landed on the island, had taken the wine from his ship and found the cave and waited. He knew what had followed. He did not need to think through each part of it. What remained was the image of his son, enormous, gentle in his way with the animals, ungifted with anything that could protect him from a man who thought carefully and moved at night and the darkness he now lived in, permanent. Given to him by a mortal who was clever and small and had wanted only to go home. Poseidon did not move from the rock shelf. He did not go to Olympus, did not put the matter before Zeus, who would have listened and said something careful about the order of things and the difficulty of reversing what had already happened to a mortal's body. Zeus would have been correct. There was nothing there to reverse. The eye was gone. What remained was the sea. And the sea Poseidon knew. Every channel, every current, every stretch of open water between the coast of Troy and the small island of Ithaca. He knew the rocks that sat just below the surface on clear days. He knew where the wind shifted unpredictably along certain passages, where the swells built without warning from the northeast. Where the shallows came up fast and offered no time for correction. He knew exactly what water could do to a man on a ship who had no favor from the god beneath it. He did not gather a storm, not yet. He simply turned his attention. That was all it took. Attention. The sea responded to where he placed his focus, the way the ground had responded to the trident, not with violence, with recognition. Something shifted in the water to the north, a pressure change. A current altering its path by a few degrees, nothing a sailor would notice for some time. Nothing that would read as anything other than ordinary weather. But it was not ordinary. He would not drown Odysseus. He had not decided that. Zeus had his eye on that particular man, had made no secret of it, and Poseidon had no interest in a confrontation over one mortal who had made one decision on one night on one island. That was not the argument he wanted to have. What he wanted was for the man to understand distance, to understand that the water between where he was and where he wanted to be was not empty space, that it belonged to something. That crossing it was not simply a matter of filling a sail and pointing toward home. He would learn that. He had years yet to learn it. Poseidon released the thought slowly. Let it settle into the current, the way sediment settles down and outward, spreading thin. The rock shelf was cold beneath him. The trident rested across his knees, its weight the same as it had always been, old and familiar. Balanced. He thought of the animal on the shore, standing in the dark, the moonlight across its back, the faint trembling of its new legs finding their ground. By now it had moved. found the water's edge perhaps, or turned inland toward whatever the land held for something like that. He did not know. He had not watched it go. That had been deliberate. Something in him had understood that the watching should end at a certain point, and then simply stop. But he thought of the breath he had heard as the water closed over him, low and soft, carried on the night air. The last sound from above. Amphitrite was nearby. He could feel it, not sight, not sound, just presence, the familiar density of her in the water not far from where he sat. She had not come to him. She did not always come. Sometimes she simply remained where she was and let the water carry the fact of her nearness across to him, which was its own kind of language. One that required nothing back. He did not move toward her. Above him, the moonlight continued its slow passage across the surface. He could not see it clearly from this depth. Only the faintest suggestion of it, a shift in the quality of the dark above, lighter in one direction than another. The horse was up there somewhere, standing on the pale gravel, or walking, or standing still again in the way that new things sometimes do, pausing in the middle of motion, arrested by the sensation of simply existing. He did not need to see it. He held the trident across his knees and felt the water press in from all sides, even and cold and deep, and let that be sufficient for now. The thought came to him the way most thoughts came now, not quickly, not with any particular urgency. It arrived the way a current shifts, without announcement, already present before he noticed it. Cleito, he had not thought of her in some time. Not in the way he was thinking of her now. She had been mortal. That was the part that stayed with him longest, when he let himself return to it. Not her face, though he remembered that. Not her voice. The part that stayed was the simple fact of her fragility. The way mortal things existed inside time differently than he did. The way a season meant something to them that it could not quite mean to him. He had wanted to give her something that would last. He rose slowly from the rock shelf. Not upward, not toward the surface. He moved laterally, following the ridge eastward for a time, then turned south through the open water. The trident moved with him. The cold pressed in from all sides, and then adjusted, recognizing him, making room. He thought of the place he had found, a rise in the ocean floor far out beyond the sight of any coast. A place where the rock came up close to the surface, not breaking through, just approaching it. A broad hill of stone beneath the water, waiting. He had stood above it once and looked down at the shape of it through the water. He had felt the possibility of it. What he made there, he made slowly. He did not strike it with the trident. That was for harder moments, for times when urgency moved through him and needed somewhere to go. This was different. He pressed his hands to the seafloor and felt the rock respond, not violently with recognition, the same way the sea responded to his attention. The stone was old. It had been beneath the water for longer than most things had existed. It rose under his hands the way breath rises in a sleeping chest. Patient, without effort. The island came up from the ocean floor. First the hill at its centre, broad and low and covered with fine pale sediment that spun off into the water as the rock climbed. Then the ground around it, levelling as it rose, forming a plain of dark stone and soil that had never seen light. It broke the surface. He was not there to see that moment. He was below, still shaping. He felt it rather than saw it, the sudden change in pressure when the rock reached air, the way the water divided around it and fell back on both sides. He felt the hill settle, find its ground. Then he began the rings. He cut them with the trident, working from the centre outward. First a circle of water close around Cleito's hill. Then a ring of land. Then water again. Then land, alternating, precise, each ring fitted against the next. The water that filled those inner channels was still and clear. It caught the light differently than open ocean. Contained, protected. He did not know, working from below, what it looked like from above. He only knew what his hands told him. the depth of each channel, the thickness of each land ring, the way the outermost wall of stone curved, smooth and unbroken, facing the open sea. When it was done, he moved back and felt the whole of it. A hill at the centre, rings of water and land around it. A place that had not existed that morning. Cleito was on the hill. He had not placed her there. She had gone on her own, he thought, or perhaps she had always been there, in the sense that the place had been made entirely around the fact of her. He was not certain which was true. Perhaps it did not matter. What he knew was this: she was at the centre. The water was between her and whatever the open sea might bring. The land rings would hold soil. Things would grow there. The channels would remain clear and still. The outermost wall would stand against the swells. Nothing from outside could reach her without passing through everything he had made. He remained below the island for a time. He could feel its weight above him, not heavy, not pressing down, but present, a new fact in the water. The ocean adjusted around it the way it adjusted around any landmass. Currents rerouted themselves slightly. The seafloor accepted its new anchor. He thought of her hands. Mortal hands, careful with things, the way mortal people learn to be careful because nothing could be easily replaced. He had watched her once moving through the rooms of an ordinary place, not a palace. Just a house on a hillside, and there had been something in the way she handled ordinary objects that he had never forgotten. The attention she gave to them, as though each one mattered individually. He had made the island because he could not give her what she actually wanted, which was more time. That was the one thing that moved through mortal hands, regardless of what he built around them. The island would outlast her. He did not let himself stay with that thought long. He pressed one hand flat against the underside of the stone, the foundation of the island, the point where it met the seafloor, and held it there for a moment. The rock was warm from its own making, newer than anything around it. It would cool in time, become indistinguishable from the old seafloor, but not yet. He could still feel the seams where the cuts had been made for the channels, the precise lines where his trident had moved through stone. They would soften eventually. Current would round the edges. Sediment would settle into the corners, but the structure itself would hold. He withdrew his hand. Above him, the moonlight continued its passage across the surface. He could not see Atlantis from here. He was too far below, too far out. Only the black water pressing down from above, and within it that faint shift of light, thin and diffuse. Arriving at this depth with nothing sharp left in it, the trident rested easy in his grip. He turned back north, moving without haste through the deep water, and let the cold of the open ocean settle around him again. The ridge was ahead, somewhere in the dark. The rock shelf where he had been sitting. Amphitrite's presence in the water not far. He moved toward none of it in particular. He simply moved through the water, through the fathoms of it, through the dark and the pressure and the slow-turning currents that carried salt and cold from every direction at once. The island was behind him, Cleito on her hill, the rings of water clear and still in the dark. He did not look back. The water changed as he moved north, not in temperature, not in depth, but in the way it carried sound. Something had reached it from the surface, a disturbance transmitted down through fathoms in the way that all surface events eventually arrive below, reduced to pressure, to a slow, rolling alteration in the water's weight. He paused. The trident stilled in his grip. Far above him, somewhere beyond sight, the sea was moving differently than it had been. The swells were longer. The rhythm of them had shifted from the pattern of open ocean to something driven, purposeful. Something was happening at the surface, and had been happening for some time. He did not need to rise to understand it. Cassiopeia had spoken her words days ago, perhaps longer. He had been below, shaping stone, cutting channels, pressing his hand against the underside of a new island. The news had reached him the way all things reached him from the mortal world, slowly, carried in the altered texture of the sea above a troubled coast. A queen of Ethiopia. Her daughter Andromeda, fair-haired and young, and Cassiopeia, who had looked at the Nereids, at the sea daughters, salt-born, older than any human throne, and found them lesser. The Nereids had not come to him demanding anything. They did not need to. Their grief moved through the water like a current. He felt it in the places where they swam, the slight cooling of the deep channels near their gathering places, the way the water held a tension it had not held before. They were not angry in the way gods were angry, loudly, with spectacle. They were simply changed, quieter than they should have been, withdrawn from places where they had once moved freely. That was enough. He had not decided quickly. That detail mattered to him, though no one would know it. He had finished Atlantis first, had felt its weight settle into the sea floor, had pressed his hand against the foundation stone and held it there before withdrawing. Then he had sent Cetus. The creature lived in the deep places, where the water was nearly black and the pressure could crush stone. It was not a monster in the way mortals use that word, something born of evil or spite. It was simply vast, old, patient in the way that only creatures of the deep were patient. It moved when called and was still when not called, and required no more instruction than a direction and a distance. He had called it. He felt it now, far to the east and south, moving through the water with the slow, deliberate pace of something that had never needed to hurry. Its wake was perceptible at this distance, a disturbance in the deep current, a displacement of water in a long, unbroken line heading toward a coast, toward Ethiopia, toward the kingdom of Cepheus, who had married Cassiopeia and sat his throne quietly while his wife spoke words that pulled the sea toward their shores. Cepheus was not cruel. That was the difficulty of it. He had not spoken the words. He was only a king married to someone who had, and now the sea was coming for his coastline, for the rocky beaches his people fished, for the boats they had pulled up above the tide line each evening. And there was Andromeda. She had not spoken the words either. She was the daughter, young, blameless in this, chained now to a rock above the waterline. Her parents had listened to an oracle, as mortals did when the sea rose and the crops failed and the fishing boats came back empty. The oracle had told them what was required. A life, hers, offered to the sea in exchange for Cepheus's kingdom being spared what was coming. He was aware of this. The water told him where she was. The coast of Ethiopia had its own acoustic signature, the particular way its cliffs deflected current, the angle of its seafloor as it rose toward the shore. He could place the rock without being there. He could feel the chain, or rather, feel the stillness around one small point on the coastline that should have been moving but was not. He did not move toward it. Cetus was moving. The sea was rising along that shore. Above the water, Andromeda waited on her rock. And somewhere, perhaps already at sea, perhaps already navigating by stars, Perseus was moving too. He was a mortal whose thread ran through every current in the region right now, visible in the way that certain mortals were visible, the ones around whom events gathered. He had seen this kind of convergence before, a hero, a monster, a girl on a rock, a coastline waiting. The pieces arranged not by his hand, but by the nature of what had been set in motion. He had sent Cetus because the insult was real, because the Nereid's grief was real, because a queen had looked at the daughters of the sea and decided they compared unfavourably to a mortal girl. And this was not something that passed without reply, but he had not arranged the rest of it. Perseus would do what Perseus would do. The sea would do what the sea did. The rock would hold Andromeda until it didn't. None of this required him to stay and watch. He turned back north. The water here was quieter. The distant pressure of Cetus moving through the southern deep was already fading, absorbed by fathoms and distance. The Nereid's grief would ease in time once the coast of Ethiopia understood what Cassiopeia's words had cost, and chose its words more carefully. This was how it worked. Not with permanence, not with lasting destruction. The lesson delivered, the sea returning to what it had been, the Nereids swimming again in the places they had withdrawn from, the trident rested easy against his palm. He moved through the water without hurry, letting the cold of the open ocean come in around him and adjust, as it always did, to his presence. The rock shelf was ahead, the ridge rising from the sea floor in a long gradual slope, its surface worn smooth in the places where he rested. Amphitrite was somewhere to the west. He could feel her the way he felt the deep currents, not by looking, but by the way the water changed when she was nearby. A slight warming, a quality of attention in the water itself, as though it knew her and turned slightly toward her presence. He did not call out to her. He moved toward the shelf and settled onto it. The stone was cold against his back, the water pressed down from above in the dark. The moonlight was still crossing the surface somewhere far overhead, diffuse and thin by the time it reached this depth. He lay the trident across his knees. South and east. Cetus moved through its own fathoms toward a coast. It had no feeling about one way or the other. The Nereids were quiet. Andromeda waited on her rock above the churning water. And here, in the deep and the dark, Poseidon sat on his shelf of stone and felt the whole ocean move around him, all of it. Every current, every pressure change, every ship crossing the surface, and every creature living below it. This was what he was. Not a king on a throne, not a god who struck the ground and demanded tribute. This, the water. The dark weight of it, the way it moved through him and he through it, neither separate from the other. He closed his hand around the trident shaft and let the stillness settle in. The stillness settled slowly, not all at once. The ocean did not go quiet in a single moment. It moved the way it always moved, in layers, in pressures, in the slow migration of cold water downward and warm water rising to take its place. Even here, on this worn shelf of stone, the water was not truly still. It shifted. It adjusted. It moved around him the way it moved around any fixed point on the seafloor. But within that movement there was something that felt like rest. He breathed. The motion was unnecessary for a god, but old. He had done it since before he understood what breathing was, since the darkness inside Cronus, where the only thing to do was wait and feel the body's instincts operating without purpose. The breath had stayed with him. A rhythm beneath all other rhythms, in and out, slow and steady, like a tide working against a sheltered cove. The trident lay across his knees. He was aware of it, the way he was aware of his own hands, not consciously. Not with attention, but as an extension of himself that registered weight and temperature without needing to be examined. The metal was cold. It was always cold. Even in the deep places where the pressure kept the water from moving much, the trident held a chill that was its own and not the ocean's. He had carried it for a long time now. There had been a moment. Years passed, centuries passed, the way gods counted, when he had set it down on the seafloor near Aegae and simply looked at it from a distance, at the shaft, at the 3 tines, each one tapering to a point that could part stone, at the object itself, separate from him, resting on the sand. He had picked it up again. Of course he had. But the moment of distance had stayed with him. Amphitrite's warmth was still there, to the west. Not close, not moving toward him. Simply present, the way she often was, nearby without being near, her attention distributed across some portion of the deep that required her presence. He did not know what she was doing. He did not need to. There were creatures moving above the shelf. Small ones. A school of something silver and quick, crossing in formation through a middle depth, their bodies angled slightly toward the surface. He felt them through the water more than saw them. A disturbance. A collective motion. They passed, and the water closed behind them, and they were gone. He thought of Delphinus, as he sometimes did in quiet stretches, the dolphin who had carried his words south, who had found Amphitrite when she had fled, not from him exactly, but from the prospect of him, from the weight of what he was and what life with him would require. Delphinus had spoken gently, or so Poseidon had always assumed. He had not been there to hear it. He had only waited, and then, eventually, she had come. He had set the dolphin among the stars in gratitude. The stars were far overhead, unreachable from this depth, hidden behind fathoms of water that absorbed all light long before it reached the bottom, but he knew they were there. The Aegean moved under them every night. The moonlight made its slow crossing, leaving that faint diffusion on the surface that filtered down through the water column and disappeared long before it found him here. His eyes were open. There was nothing to see in the conventional sense. Only darkness, graduated and total, the kind that had its own texture, its own weight. His vision worked differently down here. He did not see in the way mortals saw. He perceived. Pressure and movement and temperature, the faint chemical signals that fish used to navigate and that he read without translating directly. The way one reads a familiar shore by feel. The ridge extended to the north. He was aware of it below and behind him, the long slope of the seafloor, its surface worn smooth where he had rested before, not just tonight. Over years, over the accumulation of quiet hours when there was nothing to do but be here. The stone had shaped itself slightly to his presence, or his presence had shaped itself to the stone. He could not have said which came first. South and east, Cetus was still moving. He felt it as a slow displacement, a deep pulse in the water that was distinct from any natural current. The creature was not quick. It had no need to be. It was old enough to know that urgency was a mortal quality, that the sea had its own pace, and the wise things that lived in it learned to match that pace. He did not hurry Cetus. He never had. The Nereids were quieter now than they had been. The tension in the deep channels, that particular cooling, that quality of withdrawal, had eased somewhat, not fully. The insult was recent enough that it would take more time, but they were not as far back from their usual places. A few had returned to the shallows they preferred. He could feel the difference. Grief, even divine grief, moved like weather. It came in, pressed close, and then gradually dispersed. Not gone, absorbed. He shifted slightly against the stone. The trident moved with him. He settled again, and it settled. The water adjusted around the adjustment, small eddies spinning off his shoulders and dissolving into the dark. He had been a god for a long time, long enough that the original shape of things, the moment of the lot drawing, the feel of the stone coming out in his hand, the understanding that the sea was his, had compressed into something he carried without thinking about it. It was simply the base fact beneath everything else. The sea. The two things not quite separable. He had built walls. He had contested cities. He had shaped an island from the seafloor with his own hands, cutting rings of water and land around a hill for a mortal woman. Because the impulse to make something from the available material was old in him, he had created the horse. He had sent storms after a man who had taken something from his son. He had stood on Olympus and been a god among gods, deliberating, competing, occasionally conspiring. But here, on this shelf of worn stone, none of that was the central thing. The central thing was the pressure, the water, the darkness, the slow movement of everything living within the ocean, carrying on its business without reference to him. A large creature passed below the ridge, deep, well below his shelf. He felt its mass move through the water, something old and unhurried, navigating by some private logic. It did not come closer. It followed its own course and diminished into the black. Amphitrite's warmth still to the west. A little warmer now. She had moved slightly closer, not toward him exactly, but in his general direction. Or perhaps the water had redistributed and carried her warmth further than before. He did not reach for her. He did not need to. She was there. He was here. The water between them was the same water. It connected them as thoroughly as any touch. The trident lay heavy and still across his knees. Above, somewhere in the long column of dark water, the moonlight would be spreading across the surface, thin and silver, moving with the low swells. The ships that were out tonight would be navigating by it. The fishermen who still worked the night hours would be reading it against the horizon. He could feel each of them. He let the feeling rest where it was, neither moving toward any of it nor pulling back. Just present. Just the ocean around him, and the stone beneath him, and the slow passage of whatever the night carried. The memory of Olympus came to him the way most things came to him down here, not as a thought exactly, more as a pressure, a change in the current of his own attention. He had been there. He had stood in those high halls and eaten with the others, and taken his seat among gods who were, in the end, his family, the same blood, the same origin, the same waiting in the dark before Zeus had found the way out. And once, not long after the walls of Troy had fallen and the long war had finally exhausted itself, he had done something he did not often think about. He had helped bind his brother. It was Hera who had spoken first. She had come to him not on Olympus, not where anyone might observe, but in a hall beneath the sea where the water was calm and her voice carried without echoing. She had stood straight and composed, and she had laid out her reasoning with the careful precision of someone who had been considering it for a long time. Zeus had grown careless with his authority. He had grown certain of his own permanence in a way that made him reckless. Someone needed to remind him that the other gods existed, that they had power, that his reign was not the same thing as the world itself. Athena had been quieter about it. She did not argue. She observed. She noted the specific ways that Zeus had overreached, the decisions made without counsel, the decrees that arrived complete and uncontested. She was not angry in the way Hera was angry. She was simply attentive, and her attention had arrived at a conclusion. Poseidon had listened to both of them. He had his own grievances. He had not forgotten the contest for Athens, the salt spring rising from the rock, the assembled gods turning toward the olive tree instead. He had not forgotten standing at the edge of the Acropolis and understanding that the decision had been made and would not be revisited. He had carried that particular weight for a long time. And so he had agreed. The three of them moved in the deep hours. While Zeus lay in his chambers on Olympus, and the other gods did not look too closely at what was happening in the corridors, the chains were divine work. Not iron, something older, something that the Cyclopes might have made if they had been asked to make restraints rather than weapons. They held not by physical strength, but by something more fundamental, by the agreement of three gods acting together, which was a force the cosmos recognized. Zeus woke and found himself bound. He was furious in the way only Zeus could be furious, with the full weight of a sky god's anger, which was considerable even in restraint. But the chains held. What Poseidon had not fully accounted for was Thetis. The Nereid moved quickly when she understood what had happened. She went not to the bound god herself, but to the deep places, to the hundred-handed ones. To Briareus, who was called Aegeon in the sea's own language, one of those enormous original beings who had helped the Olympians in the Titanomachy, and who owed nothing to the conspirators and everything to the older debts of divine gratitude. Briareus came to Olympus. His hands worked faster than any three gods together could counter. The chains came off. Zeus stood. He was not merciful about it in the beginning. His voice had filled every room on the mountain, and Poseidon had felt the vibration of it even at the surface of the sea. But there was no final punishment. Perhaps Zeus understood that punishing two of the three would undo something he needed to leave intact. Perhaps he understood that what they had done, however it had ended, was a message he had needed to receive. Whatever the reason, it settled. Poseidon had returned to the sea. He had descended past the surface, and past the middle depths, and past the places where light still reached, down to where the pressure became absolute and the water held its own darkness. And he had not thought again about Olympus for some time. That was the shape of it. Not a story with clean edges, more like a current that ran through a longer, quieter history. It had happened, and then it had passed, and then the sea had continued as the sea did. Briareus. He had not thought about the 100-handed one in a long time. The name surfaced and settled. There was something right about the fact that it had been Thetis who summoned him. Thetis, the Nereid he had once wanted and had stepped away from when the prophecy came through. Her son would surpass his father, and her son had been Achilles. And Achilles had burned through the Trojan War and died young at its edge. And Thetis had carried that knowledge the whole time. She had known what was coming for her child and had not been able to stop it. He thought of her sometimes. The way she moved through the water, careful and contained. The grief she carried so steadily. The trident was still across his knees. He pressed his thumb against one of the outer tines and felt the cold metal give nothing. It never warmed. He had held it for longer than any mortal civilization had existed, and it remained precisely as cold as it had been on the day the Cyclopes handed it to him, still warm from the forge. Some things did not change with use. Above him, the ocean continued its business. He could feel the ships. He could feel the weather building slowly in the northwest, a deepening of pressure that would become wind by morning and would scatter the fishing boats if they were still out. It was not a storm exactly, more like the sea adjusting its weight. He would let it move. Amphitrite's warmth was there, still to the west, steady and unhurried. She had not moved closer. She had not needed to. The water between them carried everything without effort. Cetus was quieter, further south now. The deep pulse of it had diminished to something barely distinguishable from the ordinary rhythms of the deep. The creature had settled into its pace, and the sea had accommodated it, as the sea accommodated everything that was old enough and patient enough to find its proper movement. He exhaled slowly. The water received the exhalation without comment, without adjustment. It simply continued around him, cold and absolute, and entirely indifferent to the fact that a god was sitting on a worn stone shelf in its deepest dark, breathing for no reason except that the habit was older than thought. The memory of Olympus faded back into the larger accumulation of things that had happened. What remained was the stone, the cold of the trident, the pressure of the water, the slow, distributed awareness of everything moving above him, the ships, the swells, the weather building to the northwest, the Nereids returning to their shallows, the enormous ordinary life of the sea carrying on through the night. He let his thumb lift from the tines. The trident rested where it was, across his knees, cold and still. He did not move to set it aside. He did not tighten his grip. It simply lay there, the way it had lain across stone and sand and the backs of waves for longer than any mortal could measure. The dark around him was total. Not the dim dark of clouded nights, not the blue-black dark of shallow water. This was the dark that lived permanently, that predated the sun and would outlast it, that existed because it was the nature of great depth to have no relationship with light at all. He had descended into it so many times that it felt less like a place and more like a condition. The way sleep was a condition. The way cold was. The fishing boats above him had not moved far. He could sense them still, small pressures on the surface, rocking very gently in the swell that would build through the night. Their nets trailed below them, thin disturbances in the water column. The fish had moved southwest an hour ago. The boats had not followed. By morning the nets would come up light, and the fishermen would wonder what they had done wrong. He did not concern himself with it. The fish moved as they chose. The water carried them where they were comfortable. He was not a shepherd of fish, only of the sea itself, which was a larger and less specific responsibility. The thought arrived without force. He had drawn the lot a long time ago. He and Zeus and Hades, the three of them standing with their portions still undecided, the world freshly won from the Titans and requiring division. He did not remember what the air had smelled like that day. He did not remember whether it was morning or evening. What remained was only the sensation of the lot in his hand before he knew what it meant, the small ordinary weight of it. And then the knowing, the sea. He had walked to its edge, and then into it, and then under it, and the water had closed over him, and something had fitted itself into place that had not been fitted before. It was not a memory that required anything from him. It simply was. One of the older things, stored the way stone stored warmth from the sun, not to be recalled but to be present. A slow current moved past him from the east. It carried silt from somewhere deep, finer than dust. The particles settled around his feet, very gently, the way snow settled in a windless place. He watched it happen without watching it. His awareness was distributed across too much water to focus on any single thing for long. Amphitrite was still there, still to the west. The warmth of her presence had not changed in character or intensity. She was not waiting for him. She was not signaling. She was simply present in the way that the sea floor was present, foundational, requiring no acknowledgement. He thought of the dolphin, Delphinus, the small creature who had found her where she had gone, far from the sea, far from him, and had spoken to her in whatever voice a dolphin used to make an argument for return. He had placed Delphinus among the stars afterward. The creature deserved that. It had accomplished something persuasion rarely accomplished, a genuine change in direction, a return not compelled but chosen. Amphitrite had chosen to come back. He had not forgotten that. Over all the long accumulation of centuries, across every storm and contest and grief and anger, that fact had remained. She had come back, not because she had to, because the dolphin had made a case, and she had found the case sufficient. There were not many things in his long existence he could say that about. That they had been chosen freely by someone who had had another option. The weather to the northwest had deepened slightly. He could feel the front of it now, a long, slow pressure like a hand laid flat against the water. The wind that would come from it in the morning would be cold, coming down from the northern straits. Not dangerous. Uncomfortable. The boats still on the water would feel it before they saw it, would start making their turns toward shore in the grey hour before dawn. He had made the sea once. Or the sea had made itself, and had accepted him as the one who moved through it. He was not certain, even now, which of those was closer to the truth. The lot had given him dominion, but dominion over the sea was not the same as ownership of it. The water preceded him. It would be here after the gods had passed into whatever gods eventually passed into, which was not death, but was something. Some change of state that could not yet be named. He shifted his weight on the stone. Not discomfort exactly, something more like the adjustment a person made when they had sat long enough that the sitting itself had become something to notice. Above him, one of the Nereids passed through the middle depths, not close enough to disturb anything. Her movement was a faint warmth in the cold column of water, already fading. She was heading for shallower water, following the pull of the shore. He did not call to her. She did not know he was here. Or, if she knew, she was too practiced in the distances of divine things to let her movement show it. The trident was still cold. The stone beneath him was cold. The water around him was cold in the particular way of very deep water, which was not the cold of winter or of shade, but something more absolute. The cold of pressure, of darkness, of distance from everything that generated warmth. He pressed his thumb against the tine once more. briefly, then stilled his hand. On the surface, somewhere far above and slightly north of where he sat, a small wave broke against nothing, against open water, one swell meeting another swell and folding into it. And the sound of it reached him not as sound, but as the faintest tremor, less than a tremor, a memory of motion by the time it arrived at these depths. That was the sea in the end. Disturbance above, stillness below. The two existing simultaneously, neither one cancelling the other, the surface wild and the deep unmoved. The story ends here, but the world of Olympus dreams continues. A new myth awaits you. If these stories carry you towards sleep, follow the channel and let the next one find you. Sleep well.